all of those people who are out causing the problems at the Trump rally. The woman says, "Well, I just was passing by, and that's why I started looting and throwing rocks and burning things. I do it every day when I drive home." I was sharing that in the last hour of the show. If you were not with us, it's 7 minutes after 9 o'clock. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and News Radio 1310.com. 55 right now. A little later in the show, I got a couple of things I've got to mention about the late Chris Kyle. Memorial Day weekend may be a time to think about a lot of these people as well. The lefties in this country who are really deserving of a paddling right now tried yesterday to discredit the man, and by the end of the day, it appeared that the lefties who were talking about him, trying to make it look as if Kyle was some kind of a lying lowlife, they were served their own comeuppance. But how much do you want to bet? Now that they've done this, a lot of liberal outlets reported it, and there won't be corrections. We'll talk about that a little later in the show. About an hour left in our program this morning, and I thank you for joining us. The Resurgent, which is Eric Erickson's website, and he has a lot of different writers who are working with him there, but these are not people who are happy about Donald Trump. They are conservatives who feel Trump does not represent them. Erickson is the main man behind the Never Trump movement, saying that he'd prefer Hillary Clinton over Donald Trump because he knows what we'd be getting. We were talking about people smoking dope in the last hour. Maybe they're doing that at the Resurgent too, but every once in a while the smoke clears, and you actually get a pretty decent column out of these people. David Sharoon, who is writing at that website today, says, "Make no mistake, violent left-wing protests are strengthening Trump's campaign." And I brought this up the other day. Way back in the 1960s and the 1970s, there, in fact, is a book written, and it's written by a liberal writer from an outfit called, trying to remember the name. Oh, Rolling Stone. Is it Rolling Stone? This fellow wrote a book called Nixon Land. And it's all about how Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon profited from the outbreaks of violence in the 1960s and the early 1970s in this country and had stellar political careers because of that. Nixon was supposedly a completely washed-up guy in 1962 because he lost a election for governor to Jerry Brown's daddy in California. And Ronald Reagan, of course, had been a spokesman for Barry Goldwater in 1964, and Goldwater went down to a humiliating defeat. And conservatism was supposedly dead, and Reagan and Nixon were supposedly dinosaurs, and they would never be revived. And then a few months after Lyndon Johnson was sworn in for his only one real term as president after defeating Goldwater, there was a huge riot in Watts, which was a part of Los Angeles. And in the age of television, Americans got to see all of this going on, and Americans were being told, well, Johnson would sit there and say, "I think we all need to give these poor folks more of your money, and then that way all their lives will be better, and they'll be grateful." And then they all went out and burned down the city, and people said, "Well, wait a minute. Why am I giving them my money if they're going to do that? Now they're looting my store, too. Oh, holy smokes. You got to be kidding." So Ronald Reagan came along, and Ronald Reagan said, "I'm going to run for governor in California." And Ronald Reagan said, "I'm sick to death of people burning down cities. I'm sick to death of students rioting on campus and smashing windows. They're there to go to class, dang it, and get an education." And the voters in liberal California said, "You know what? We like this guy." And they voted for him twice, made him governor. Nixon was watching all of this happen, and Nixon campaigned for public office in 1968, the presidency. Guess what? He won. Because, again, Nixon said, "I'm not going to allow these people to rule the streets. I'm going to go in there. We're going to have the cops hit them over the head." And people went dang straight. And I think most Americans still feel that way. You want to be safe, and you see these pictures of these thugs, these Bernie Sanders thugs, these Democrats and socialists, and you realize they are a cancer on this culture. It's 9/11. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310. KLIX and News Radio 1310.com. 56 right now. So this writer says, "The far left has responded in kind to Trump by attempting to bully Trump and his supporters into silence in the name of political correctness. If their end is to cast Trump as a fascist, their means have ironically produced the opposite effect." Did you see the photos from Albuquerque the other day where they were beating up on the man, the Trump supporter who was in a wheelchair? Yeah, the guy's in a wheelchair. And these young leftist thugs are pouring water on him and attacking him. And, of course, the police allowed it to go on, which was even sadder. I guess they thought, well, the guy in the wheelchair was probably probably the instigator because, well, he was a Trump supporter, right? The writer says such tactics from the left cause me to sympathize with his supporters and his message, and I know I am not alone. If such activities are to continue for the next 5 months, more and more Republicans who would otherwise oppose Trump will warm up to him. Well, if that's bad for Hillary, then I'm in. Go out and burn some more buildings down, liberals. Please, go right ahead. Not mine, but, just keep it up. And then we have this. This is from David Hersani writing at The Federalist. Donald Trump's secret weapon is Hillary Clinton. Yes, the shrew is still out there campaigning. Her media friends are all trying to defend her today, claiming, well, this business about her emails is really nothing to... there's no smoking gun here. Are you kidding me? We now have evidence of what a bald-faced liar this broad is. Clear evidence coming from the State Department where she used to work, and now we know that they were telling her, you can't do this, you can't do this. And she kept saying, I'm above the law, I'm above the law, I'm a Clinton, I'm above the law. She could go to prison. Wow, wouldn't that be sweet to see her walking around in the orange jumpsuit? Her husband, meanwhile, would be like, I think you ought to take your time before you get out of here. I got a lot of things to take care of now that the house is empty. If you know what I mean. He'll have some more of that indoor-outdoor carpeting put down in his old ranchero. He'll be back to work in no time. Bill Colley with you this morning, 736-0300. You're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. You're on the air.
Yes, Bill, the cancer is inoperable brain cancer, and there's nothing we can do to save them. And somehow we've got to eliminate them somehow. I know they're not going to go anywhere, but, the people that think they know better and should know better need to seize control as it was designed. But how we do that, I don't know.
Well, years ago when we went through all of this, 45 years ago, what ended it was two things ended it. Number one, all of their heroes, they were mainly entertainers, all end up killing themselves by shooting up heroin and the like. And number two, Kent State, a really harsh response, sort of convinced them that maybe this is not the safest thing to do.
Well, let's face it, they're far from courageous, and they're far from convicted. And so they may be convicted, but they have no conviction. And so, I like you say, I don't know that they're really up for the fight, but the good people are too busy trying to be good, raising their families, being honest, and other things of that nature. And so, sometimes the fight is no fun, but as one person said once, all it takes for evil to flourish is for good men to do nothing.
Very true. I thank you much for the telephone call. Regular Americans are trying to find a way to scratch out a living so they can keep up with all of the losses they've had to endure because of the globalization we've experienced in recent decades. As simple as that. And, when I was a kid growing up and I was talking about, my father's harsh conditions around the house, and appreciate it now, of course, but I went off to college, and I did the first 2 years at a community college. I kept working, kept my job that I'd had in high school, and was able to go to school and do both. And so I came out of the first 2 years with college with no debt, and then I had to go off to a 4-year state school. And I met all these people all the time that I was in college with who were, they were constantly on the party circuit, and they were constantly going to concerts. And I'd say, what did it cost to go to that concert? And they'd throw a figure out there, and I'd think, why don't you just go buy the CD? CDs were just coming out at the time. Because you could buy the CD for a few bucks, and you just spent 10 times that to go see them in concert. What for? Because my experience was, the few times I've ever been to a concert in my life, the studio stuff is better. It just simply is. I don't get it. But we couldn't afford to do those things. Our goal was, and I was in college, to get an education. I had a roommate who would get ticked off at me because I would go to my first class at 8:10 in the morning for a couple of years. And I would get my classes done early, and I always wanted the shades open in the room. This guy would sleep till 11 o'clock or noon, and he didn't like the sunshine coming in. Well, he'd say, well, I had to be up studying, man, because you don't do any of it. Well, no. You sleep till noon, and then you go to class till 6 p.m., and then you have to study from 6 p.m. to 3 a.m. I go to class at 8 a.m. I'm done by noon. I come home, and while you're off eating lunch and then going to class, I'm doing my studying. it's just it's just different lifestyles, different approaches to how we were raised, and I think about that. I didn't have time to go out and burn flags and go to protests and do all of those things. It just we didn't. Well, that's not what I was there for. And my parents, who couldn't afford to foot the bill in the first place, uh, if they had been footing the bill, it would have even been tighter for me. But the fact of the matter is, I saw all of these people who were there just to basically sail through and let's go to this concert and this party and it just do I feel deprived after all these years because I couldn't go do all those things? I may have at the time, but looking back on it, no, not at all, not in any way or form, or just and I think that we have these expectations when we're young, and why not? Everyone wants to dream and see the world and get as many of these experiences in as they can. But I got to be honest with you. Sometimes they're the wrong experiences. And if you're still 40, 50 years old, and some of the Bernie Sanders supporters obviously are that way, some of them are in their 70s, they're still chomping the granola and smoking the ganja and walking around thinking everything should be free. And, never the twain shall meet. I mean, the bridge between our side and their side, the chasm is so big right now, I don't see it being put back together. And our caller said we got to eliminate them. Well, I don't know. That, very draconian, and I don't think he's suggesting we go out there and, take Louisville sluggers and crack them all over the head one by one by one by one. After the first 10,000, most of them would probably go into hiding. But I think what he means is we've got to find a way. What we need is we've thrown out all the restrictions and regulations that we used to culturally have. But, you wouldn't want to hurt anybody's feelings. But we used to have social control and social pressure. And when we had those things in life, it used to be embarrassing, for instance, for a woman to get knocked up when she wasn't married and have a child. And now it's common, and it's common in all demographics, and it's common among all races. It happens across ethnic lines. And media says, oh, wasn't that wonderful that movie star Joey and movie star Jenny, that they just had a baby out of wedlock. And put their picture on the cover of People magazine. Bill Colley with you on Top. So the rot continues, and everyone out there says the rot is okay and that the rot is good, and here we are, 20 minutes after 9 o'clock, $20 trillion in debt. Manufacturing pretty much has moved out of the country and hollowed it out. Our businesses along Main Street are falling down and collapsed and boarded up. Detroit, Michigan is nothing but rubble. Yeah, it's worked out really well, hasn't it? 57 right now. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, newsradio1310.com. Before we wrap up today, speaking of these attacks on our culture and what we used to honor, attacks on a great American yesterday, we've got to share that with you in a few minutes. I'm well aware that most people who, even if they're fans of this show, don't have the time to listen to every live minute of it throughout the 2 hours it's on the air. Sometimes you have an appointment you've got to go to. Sometimes you've got children you've got to tend to. There are other things that get in the way of always listening to the program, so you may not have heard it, but last week I was telling a caller, we were talking about this bathroom baloney, about having the grubby grown men who want to wear dresses come in and squat next to your daughters. And I said, if there was one area that we could find common cause with the Islamic world, it would be an issue like that, because those people, they don't go for that kind of stuff. And they're not going to like it if someone tries to do that with their daughters in the restroom. 924, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. I'm getting to something here, and I'll get to it in just a moment. I do want to remind you, coming up next week on our program, Dr. Jonathan Tripp and his associates, of course, join us every Wednesday. And we'll probably have Jeremy Daly along, one of the physician assistants. He's next up, I think, in the rotation. That'll be between 8:30 and 9 o'clock next Wednesday morning. Couple of things. Dr. Tripp and his family are going on a mission trip down to Nicaragua and into the jungles of Nicaragua. And Dr. Tripp is saying that his sons are going to pay their own way, which is a wonderful thought, a wonderful approach to take with your children. But in order to do that, they need to earn some money, and that means they've got to mow some yards and scrub some pools and do those things. So if you'd like to get in touch with his office, and you can actually line up someone to do some of this work for you, it will help pay for the trip and Trip's trip, if you will. And we just wanted to remind you about that. Also, we should point out that you have an opportunity to ask any questions, medical questions you have, while one of the pros is here in the studio with us. Trip Family Medicine is located in Twin Falls, directly across from the main post office on Fillmore Street. And remember, life's too short not to feel good. Christian Post, another one of those things I get in my daily email that I highly recommend you sign up for. Peaceful Muslims who live outside the United States think American society, quote, has gone completely insane, unquote, over LGBT issues. Sheikh Hamza Yusuf said on a Monday panel hosted by the Southern Baptist Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. After discussing President Barack Obama's edict directing all public schools to base their bathroom use policies upon gender identity rather than biological sex, the moderator turned to Yusuf to ask how Muslims view the issue. Even to think about it is probably a difficult question for a lot of Muslims, he responded. In the Muslim world, they think we're a society that's gone completely insane. He is an American Sunni Muslim scholar. Now, also on the panel, we had Russell Moore, but we also had Archbishop William Blorey. He used to be my archbishop in the Baltimore Archdiocese of the Roman Catholic Church. Get this, I did not know this. I thought the letter that went out to schools across the country from the Obama White House that said, you're going to have to allow boys and girls to use the same bathrooms and locker rooms, went to just the public schools. Archbishop Blorey says all of the parochial schools in Maryland and Delaware, again in my former archdiocese, they all received the same letter from the government saying, you will do this. So even though his church believes that this is wrong, now can you imagine, we have some Muslim schools in this country. What's going to happen when they get that order? Or did they? I'm sure they burned it. I hope they did. 927, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. It's 54. You're on the air. You're up next.
Good morning, Bill. You know, it all, this liberalism and stuff comes back to spirituality in our nation. And it truly is, you know, we're at a time now probably where there's more sin in our nation than at any other time since Jesus was here.
I'd agree with that.
Yeah, and less people bringing their children up in church. But I know that, you know, in 2 Chronicles in chapter 7, verse 14, God said, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face, then I will hear I will hear them from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. And I know that God is the same today as he was yesterday and forever. And if we would get back to that.
Unfortunately, and I thank you for the call, it appears we're headed in the other direction. And thank you much. To remind you that there is the Old Testament notion that says if you no longer have a use for God, he no longer has a use for you. Now, he won't come in and necessarily harm you, but if he walks away from you, someone else may do it. It's a bit like, being on the street corner and you're talking to a policeman and then you say, hey, get out of here, Flatfoot, and the guy decides to leave. And then a thug comes up and smacks you because there's no policeman there on the corner any longer. It's the same, proposition that you're looking at with all of this. There are 11 states that have decided, led by Texas, to sue the president about this bathroom directive. Unfortunately, I was surprised that our own Lawrence Wasden, AG here in the state of Idaho, did not get on board with this lawsuit. It just mentions 11 states, and I ran down through the list, and we're not there. Even though supposedly all of the leadership, including, Sherry Ibarra at the Department of Education here in Idaho, says she also disagrees with this directive. And yet, nobody apparently decided they wanted to get on board with this lawsuit. I hope it's more than lip service, because if they're doing any listening to talk radio, whether they're listening to my coworker Kevin up in Boise or they're listening to me, I think they're probably getting some public reaction that should say, people here don't want this. We'll take more of your calls coming up in a few minutes. It's 9:30. Bill Colley with you on Top Story. It's 57 right now as well on News Radio 1310 KLIX. Steve Berman, who writes at The Resurgent, I mentioned that earlier, it's Eric Erickson's website, says many parents feel they can just ride this one out. And as one parent put it, quote, keep her head in the sand and not deal with it, unquote. Fair enough, he writes. My wife and I simply told our soon-to-be first grader that if a girl walked into his school boys' room, not to go in there or to leave as soon as he could. He said, we think it's wrong, and some parents are pulling their kids out of public schools, but the private schools will not have any other options either. They've been backed against the wall. Well, you've got to remember, President Obama thinks he can interpret what the law means, and this was not the intent of Title IX when it was passed back in the early 1970s. And now he says he's going to punish schools by withholding funding, which, remember, not President Obama or the agencies, but Congress controls where that federal money goes. So he's twice now in violation. It's not the first time this has happened. 9:34. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. 736-0300, and you're up next.
Good morning, Bill. Bill, I think I have the solution for the rioting anarchists who are taking a chance of getting people permanently injured or even killed. The police should round these people up, make them show their IDs, take mugshots of them, especially the ones wrapped in the Mexican flags. Then these people will realize it's no longer fun to be rioting like that.
Thank you. Well said. We're headed toward, I think, that crack up in this country where I wrote a column one time for a website I used to help manage years ago and said America may need someone along the lines of Francisco Franco, and two things immediately happened. A friend of mine who grew up in Cuba and had to flee after the Castros took control of the country, and his family was also not terribly happy with the predecessor, Batista. He scolded me for writing it, and then another friend from Portugal, he told me as well, he said, I'm sorry, but you're completely wrong on this one. But what happened in Spain in the 1930s, they were absolutely on the same path that we are. The communists were taking control, their own versions of Bernie Sanders, their own versions of the rioters. They were going out, they were looting churches, they were killing the priests, they were breaking down all of the social barriers with people, they were having sex in the streets. Franco happened to be running an army across the Mediterranean Sea and I believe Spanish Morocco, and he suddenly got a phone call and someone said, you got to come home, And he and his fellow generals all came home, and you know what? They crushed the communists, and they put all of these other people back in the closet and said, you know what? As long as you stay there, you'll be okay. Now, he is a tard because he supposedly was close to Hitler and Mussolini, but he did not get involved in World War II. He sat that out. And then after the war became a great ally of the Western powers, the United States, Britain, and the like. And he saved his country, which otherwise was spinning into anarchy. Now, here's the thing. We don't want that in this country, right? We don't want it. But we're headed that way because if there's going to be a crack up, it's not going to be all of these leftists who can't even tie their own shoes who are going to be running things. They're trying, and they've been failing now miserably for 50 years. And these street thugs, if they get in control, I don't think they're going to be able to do it. On the other hand, you don't have to go very far around here to see somebody driving a pickup truck with a gun rack in the back of it and know that our side can handle itself, and it is just we're at break point. We really are, and it behooves the American left to settle down and say, all right, you know what? We're not going to push quite so hard. And maybe we're not going to be able to tell people how they're going to live and tell them this is exactly how the world is going to run anymore. And I think that there's got to be a point where people stand down, take a deep breath, and realize that. And we've got to be getting very close to it. Coming up on 9:38, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And I thank you for joining us this morning. Meanwhile, Palatine, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago, you would assume it would be very, very liberal. A group of parents there are now suing the Obama White House. And saying they're doing this because they have simply grown fed up with this bathroom directive, and they're looking out for the security of their kids. Obviously, the President of the United States isn't, and that's what they view as a serious threat to the safety of their children. And you as a parent, the President of the United States really has just one responsibility, and that's to ensure that the people of America are safe. You as a parent have really the prime responsibility of making sure your children are safe. Now, my guess is some parents aren't very good at that, although they mean well. We put them in jail when they mess up sometimes. President Obama is messing up, and he's traveling around the world. He'll be bowing in Hiroshima today, saying he's sorry for the fact that the Japanese started World War II. You just look out for that. I'm telling you, we're dealing with a guy who's, if he doesn't mean it, he's a fruitcake. If he does mean it, he is a huge danger to the republic. And thank the Lord, there is only so much more damage he can do before January 20th, 2017, which is not that far away. But his successor could well be worse. And we have to convince people of that she is going to be a moral hazard like we've never seen before. Bill Colley with you. We're going to talk about a great American in a few minutes on News Radio 1310, KLIX and News Radio 1310. A great American who the left is trying once again to tear down. His name was Chris Kyle. Now, we'll share that in a few minutes. There was a small town in Georgia that decided it was going to honor the dead, those who gave their lives fighting in wars for this country, by erecting white crosses. Apparently, if they had, done crescent moons, it would have been okay, but Media Research Center says a Memorial Day display in Paulding County, Georgia was quickly taken down after complaints were made regarding its religious overtones. The city of Hiram received calls questioning whether a display of crosses was an appropriate way to honor its fallen war heroes, prompting the city's leadership to remove them. You realize the liberals are trying to get that giant cross outside Arlington National Cemetery ripped down. Were you aware of that? That's true. The atheists and their fellow travelers among the liberal gang have been working hard for that for several years. I had a friend of mine on air who led the campaign to save the Bladensburg Cross just this past year. You may have heard him on the program with us. His name is Sean Riley. And Sean was, for a time, he was the man in charge of, lobbying is not always a bad thing in Washington. He was the chief lobbyist for the American Legion in Washington on Capitol Hill. And every day he would drive home past the Bladensburg Cross, which is this gigantic cross that was erected by war veterans from World War I back in the late 1920s. And guess what? Lefty couldn't stand it. Lefty demanded it had to be taken down. And thanks to the efforts of Sean by bringing this to national attention, Sean's daddy was the chairman of the Republican Party back home, so I know the family very well. Sean told me that through his efforts, and he was writing about it, and he was on radio programs and TV programs across the country, the Bladensburg Cross still stands. The crosses on Highway 92 were an appropriate Memorial Day display to many people, but a short time after the crosses went up outside the city of Hiram building, they came down, reports WSB-TV in Atlanta. The handmade crosses were meant to represent the 79 Paulding Countyans who died in America's war. The city's mayor and others were behind the plan, which attracted praise but simultaneous criticism. Apparently, even in the old Bible Belt, in Georgia now, you cannot honor your war dead, whom apparently all were Christian, right? And you still cannot put up 79 crosses. Meanwhile, story broke yesterday morning. I saw it late. Benito shared it with me. And you had a liberal publication that was saying Chris Kyle, a great American hero for many of us, had lied about the medals that he received during his service as a Navy SEAL, and had lied about the number of kills that he had, although they provided no evidence of a different number when it came to his kills. And this story languished for much of the day, being picked up by MSDNC and all of the other rotten liberal media in Washington and across the country. But by the end of the day, some holes started to get poked in all of this. Eric Erickson writes, again, we're picking up the resurgent here. Chris Kyle's DD-214, and that's probably DD 2014 from the Navy, which compiles. You folks who actually have one of these could probably fill me in on the best pronunciation, which compiles all of his awards and commendations. Shows Kyle actually received 6, not 5 Bronze Stars with Valor, in addition to his 2 Silver Stars. So in other words, Kyle underreported in his book. He underreported the number of medals that he was actually awarded for his work. That shouldn't be the story, or should be the story, the writer says, but the left in its ongoing war to discredit any American hero it cannot otherwise declare gay or transgendered has decided to attack Chris Kyle in order to attack the SEALs as a whole. If you read the Department of the Navy's response to the request from this liberal website, you see this language in the second paragraph, quote, a reasonable copy of available responsive award citations is enclosed, unquote. A reasonable copy. Erickson says it is possible. They cannot find the records to reflect the certificate. And he says, I have a friend who served in the Army, has all his paperwork to prove it along with eyewitnesses, and the Army has no available record of his service. So this is not unusual. What they were trying to do, and it was finally buried deep in the story from the liberal gang, it was buried near the bottom of the story, that there may have been some confusion in the number of medals. And I'm thinking, how can you then make this claim? But they wanted to try to tell you that Chris Kyle was a bad guy because he shot those poor minorities. Oh, and all those poor minorities were trying to do was blow the legs off your fellow Americans who probably deserved it because of their white privilege. 9:48. Bill Colley with you on Top Story. You're up next. You're on the air.
Yeah, the document is called the DD-214 in the Navy, and that's what it's called. And again, it's just the seriousness of the crime.
Well, seriousness in what way? Guess we lost our caller. He did not even realize how many he had, at least when he wrote the book. Now, he's been dead a few years. He can't defend himself. So these people just think, aha, just before Memorial Day weekend, let's attack him. What does it tell you about the American left? Because also buried in that same story this leftist publication had was a comment from one of his officers saying, I don't think you realized what this man actually did and the level of his heroics and his bravery. But this was all buried as they were trying to portray him as being some lying, knuckle-dragging behemoth who just wanted to go out and salivate at the prospect of killing those brown people. Bill Colley with you. Of course, Memorial Day weekend coming up, and I shared with you in the beginning of the program, Steve Millington had mentioned last night at the Twin Falls County Republican Committee meeting that many of our cemeteries are already decked out, and he said 800 flags were planted yesterday in Buell alone, which tells you there are still many people who believe in all of this. I wanted to share with you, and I'll maybe do a bit more of this tomorrow as well. I own a copy. I have the DVDs at home of Band of Brothers, and I think I've watched it. At this point, I can almost memorize certain scenes and repeat them. And many of you may remember from that series, that beautiful music, the introduction. How many of you were aware that words were later added to that, and that the words are just about the most stirring thing you could ever hear? Do you know the singer Katherine Jenkins? She's a mezzo-soprano. She's from Wales, which, of course, is part of the United Kingdom. And she's the most popular singer when it comes to the armed forces in England. This is her, and she is actually singing Requiem for a Soldier, which is the theme from Band of Brothers. Take a listen, if you will, for a moment. Katherine Jenkins with Requiem for a Soldier, which most of you would know from Band of Brothers, was the main theme in that particular movie. And as I said earlier, I own a copy of that on DVD, which I keep at home. I spent 3 years, 2013, it's been 3 years. 3 years ago, this coming Memorial Day weekend, I spent it in Washington, D.C., and it was one of the most moving experiences of my life. I went to Arlington National Cemetery that Saturday and walked through it. We got off the train, we walked through the cemetery. We didn't take the tour bus. We just walked all the way around it, from one end of that big old circle up the hill and back down, and stopped for the changing of the guard as well, which I hadn't seen since I was a kid. I saw it a couple of times when I was young. My dad took me there when I think I was 11 or 12 years old. And then I went back with a school group when I was 13. So I hadn't been to Arlington since then. And we were walking around the cemetery this day, and it was beautiful day, about 70 degrees, barely a cloud in the sky. And we were walking around the cemetery, and we saw this gray-haired man, and he was walking along, and he was putting stones atop the gravestones, small pebbles. If you ever saw the movie Schindler's List, you know that's I think a Jewish tradition as well, where they do that. We stopped to talk to him, and he was explaining to us. He said, "What I do is," he said, "I visit the graves and I put the small stone there, and that lets the relatives know when they come to visit later this weekend that these people aren't forgotten, that other people have been here. The stone is the marker that says somebody else has been here to pay respects." And we walked up this one path with him, and he was pointing out some of the graves that Lee Marvin is buried there, for instance, who, of course, was a veteran of the campaign at Iwo Jima, and also Joe Louis. And, we stopped and looked at those gravestones. But then you've got thousands from people who obviously their names aren't known beyond their own families, and the people that they served with who are buried there as well. And we got up to the top of the hill, and I remember looking down, and you can see the entire city of Washington below. And there's just nothing but these rows and rows and rows. Crosses, most of them, by the way, we should point out. And the enormity of it is almost overwhelming. And then we walked down the hill, and when we left the cemetery, we walked across the bridge on the Potomac River. Nearly got blown over. Very windy day, as it turned out to be. And we walked up and around the corner at the Lincoln Memorial just in time to see this. It was Rolling Thunder was in town, and the bikers, they were sitting for a group picture on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And not all of them, they couldn't fit all of them there because, there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of them descend on Washington for Memorial Day weekend. But every bit of that stairway was filled with a veteran who was sitting down there from one end to the other and from the bottom to the top. And I got there just at the moment they were posing for the photograph. And I got to snap some of the photos myself. And just such a stunning scene. And then we walked through the crowd, and we were talking to some of the men some of them had driven as far away as Arizona to come to the event and ride their motorcycles. And I'll tell you what, if you've never had an opportunity to go there for Memorial Day weekend, and then we stayed in a hotel, the same hotel where Joe Mantegna and Gary Sinise were eating their dinner every night, because they were putting on a show down on the National Mall by the Capitol building. And tremendous thrill, and perhaps the best trip I ever made for the course of 3 days in my life. And we'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow, and some thoughts about that as well. And I might share a bit more of the music with you too, if we have an opportunity. We're not here on Monday because we're taking the day off at News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com, and that is to honor the memories of those who never came home. Rush Limbaugh is coming up next following the news at 10 o'clock. Bill Colley with you saying, God willing, if the creek don't rise, they'll allow me to come back and do this all over again tomorrow morning between 8 and 10 right here on KLIX.